He was not sick. Those words kept looping through my mind as I stood frozen in my own hallway at 5:47 in the morning, listening to my husband laugh with someone in our bedroom. Not the weak, pained laugh of a man battling pneumonia. A genuine, healthy, conspiratorial laugh that made my blood turn to ice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dr. Elena Voss. I am 38 years old, and until that dawn in early March, I believed I had built a life worth protecting. I run a private medical research consultancy in Seattle, Washington, specializing in clinical trial design for biotechnology companies. Over the past 9 years, I have helped 17 pharmaceutical companies navigate FDA approval processes, contributed to research that has brought 6 life-saving medications to market, and built a reputation as one of the most meticulous scientific consultants on the West Coast. My client list includes names you would recognize, companies whose products sit in medicine cabinets across America, and my annual consulting fees reflect the value I bring to an industry where precision and credibility mean everything. I met my husband Daniel 7 years ago at a medical conference in San Francisco. I was presenting research on adaptive clinical trial designs. He was there representing a medical equipment supply company, attending sessions to better understand the needs of research institutions. We met at a networking reception where he approached me with intelligent questions about patient recruitment challenges. He was charming without being aggressive, genuinely interested in the science rather than simply trying to make a sale. He had warm brown eyes, an easy smile, and a way of listening that made you feel heard. We talked for 3 hours that night about everything from FDA regulations to our favorite hiking trails in the Pacific Northwest. Our courtship was steady and comfortable. Daniel was supportive of my demanding career, never complained about the long hours I dedicated to client projects or the frequent travel my work required. He had a stable job managing regional sales for a medical supply distributor, earning a respectable income but nothing approaching what my consultancy generated. That difference never seemed to bother him. He would joke that he was happy to be married to the brains of the operation while he handled the charm and social skills. We married 3 years after we met in a small ceremony overlooking Puget Sound with our closest friends and family present. The first 5 years of our marriage were what I considered successful. We purchased a home in the Fremont neighborhood, a beautifully restored Craftsman with enough space for my home office, and a workshop where Daniel could pursue his hobby of woodworking. We traveled together when my schedule allowed, hiked the Cascades on weekends, and hosted dinner parties where Daniel's natural charisma made him the center of attention, while I was content to observe and enjoy watching him shine. Our life felt balanced. I provided the financial stability and intellectual engagement, while he provided the warmth and social connection that came less naturally to me as someone who spent most days analyzing data and writing technical reports. My work had grown substantially over those years. What started as a solo consultancy operating from a spare bedroom had expanded into a small firm with 3 full-time employees, and a roster of clients that kept us booked 18 months in advance. I had developed proprietary methodologies for optimizing clinical trial protocols that pharmaceutical companies were willing to pay premium rates to access. My reputation for identifying potential regulatory issues before they became expensive problems had made me the first call for companies preparing to submit new drug applications to the FDA. The financial success of my consultancy had allowed us to live very comfortably. Our home was paid off within 4 years of purchase. We maintained substantial savings and investment accounts. I had established retirement funds for both of us and carried excellent disability insurance given that my income depended entirely on my cognitive abilities and professional reputation. Daniel had continued working in medical supply sales, though his income represented perhaps 15% of our household earnings. He seemed content with that arrangement, occasionally mentioning that he appreciated not having the pressure of being the primary breadwinner, and enjoyed the flexibility his position offered. 3 months ago, in early December, Daniel came home from work complaining of chest congestion and fatigue. By the following day, he had developed a fever and difficulty breathing. I drove him to our physician, who diagnosed him with pneumonia and prescribed antibiotics, along with strict instructions for rest and monitoring. Daniel's condition seemed to worsen over the next week despite treatment. He developed a persistent, rattling cough that kept both of us awake at night. His fever would break temporarily and then return. He lost weight rapidly as his appetite disappeared. Our physician ordered chest imaging and blood work. The results showed that Daniel had developed a severe bacterial pneumonia that was proving resistant to the initial antibiotics prescribed. He was switched to a more aggressive treatment protocol, but his recovery remained frustratingly slow. By the new year, he had been ill for nearly a month with minimal improvement. His doctor began discussing the possibility of hospitalization if his condition did not turn around soon. I became Daniel's primary caregiver during this period. My work allowed me to maintain flexible hours, handling most client communication through video calls and email, while staying close to home to monitor his condition. I prepared meals he could tolerate, managed his medication schedule, tracked his symptoms, and accompanied him to follow-up appointments. Daniel seemed genuinely miserable, spending most days in bed or on the couch, barely having energy for conversation. The vibrant, social man I had married had been reduced to someone who could hardly make it down the stairs without needing to rest. The illness dragged through January and into February. Daniel's doctor assured us that some patients simply took longer to recover from severe pneumonia, particularly when the initial infection had been so aggressive. We were told to be patient, to continue the treatment protocol, and to watch for any signs of serious deterioration that would warrant hospitalization. Daniel's employer had been understanding about his extended absence, assuring him that his position would be waiting when he recovered. I continued to balance caregiving with maintaining my consulting work, grateful that my business was established enough to weather a period of reduced personal productivity. Throughout those months of illness, Daniel was utterly dependent on me. I brought him meals, administered his medications, helped him to the bathroom when he was too weak to manage alone, and sat with him during the worst nights when his coughing fits seemed endless. He would look at me with what appeared to be genuine gratitude, thanking me for taking care of him, apologizing for being such a burden. I assured him that this was what marriage meant, that I would always be there when he needed me, that his health was more important than any work deadline or client meeting. I took pride in being able to provide that care. My medical background, while focused on research rather than clinical practice, gave me confidence in managing his treatment protocol and recognizing warning signs that might require immediate medical attention. I consulted with his physician regularly, asked detailed questions about his progress, and maintained meticulous records of his symptoms and medication responses. If anything, the experience reinforced my sense that our marriage was built on a solid foundation. When crisis came, we could depend on each other. My consulting work continued throughout this period, though at a reduced intensity. I had delegated more responsibilities to my 3 employees, trusting them to handle client communications and preliminary analysis, while I focused on the high-level strategic work that clients specifically hired me to provide. My team rose to the challenge admirably, and several clients sent messages expressing their appreciation for our continued excellent service despite my personal circumstances. The business remained profitable and my professional reputation intact. By late February, Daniel's condition had plateaued. He was no longer getting worse, but he was also not showing the improvement we had hoped to see. His doctor ordered additional testing to rule out complications or underlying conditions that might be impeding his recovery. We were scheduled for a comprehensive follow-up appointment in mid-March to review those results and potentially adjust his treatment approach. It was during this period of medical limbo that I received an urgent request from one of my most important clients, a biotechnology company based in Boston that was preparing to submit a new drug application for a breakthrough cancer treatment. They needed me to review their complete clinical trial documentation and provide a final assessment before submission. The timeline was extremely tight. They needed my analysis within 1 week to meet their filing deadline. This was exactly the type of high-stakes, time-sensitive work that had built my reputation. The fee for this rush project was substantial, and maintaining this relationship was crucial for my business. I explained the situation to Daniel, told him I would need to work intensively for several days to complete the analysis, and asked if he felt stable enough for me to dedicate that focused time to the project. He assured me he was feeling somewhat better, that he could manage on his own during the day while I worked, and that I should absolutely take on this important assignment. I set up a temporary workspace in my home office and immersed myself in the project. For 5 days, I worked from early morning until late evening, reviewing thousands of pages of clinical trial data, regulatory documentation, and safety analyses. I would check on Daniel periodically throughout the day, bringing him meals and ensuring he was taking his medications on schedule, but otherwise remained focused on delivering the thorough, meticulous analysis my client was paying for. The work was consuming in the way that complex scientific analysis always is for me. I lost track of time, barely noticed the progression of days, and fell into bed exhausted each night only to wake and resume the analysis each morning. Daniel seemed to understand and appreciate the importance of this project. He was quieter than usual during those days, spending most of his time in our bedroom resting, occasionally coming downstairs for meals but generally keeping to himself to avoid interrupting my concentration. On the morning of March 7th, I completed my analysis at approximately 3 in the morning. I had been working through the night to finish the final sections of my report, triple-checking my calculations and recommendations before submitting them to the client. The completed document was comprehensive and thorough, representing some of my best work. I sent it off at 3:28 in the morning, feeling the simultaneous satisfaction of a job well done and the bone-deep exhaustion of sustained intense focus. I should have gone directly to bed. My eyes burned from hours of screen time. My shoulders ached from hunching over my laptop. My mind felt foggy with fatigue, but I was too wired from the completion of the project to sleep immediately. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the quiet darkness of our kitchen, allowing my mind to gradually downshift from the hypervigilance required for detailed scientific analysis. As I sat there in the pre-dawn stillness, I thought about Daniel sleeping upstairs. I felt a wave of gratitude that his condition had been stable enough for me to complete this important project. I also felt guilty for having been so absorbed in my work for the past several days. Yes, I had checked on him regularly and ensured his basic needs were met, but I had not been as present or attentive as I had been during the earlier stages of his illness. I decided that once I had rested, I would take a break from new client work and dedicate more focused time to supporting his recovery. The tea helped calm my overstimulated mind. By 4:30 in the morning, I was finally feeling ready for sleep. I turned off the kitchen lights and made my way quietly upstairs, not wanting to wake Daniel as I slipped into bed beside him. Our bedroom door was closed, which was unusual. We typically left it open for better air circulation, but I assumed Daniel had closed it to avoid being disturbed by any noise from my late-night working session. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I reached for the door handle and began to turn it when I heard voices from inside our bedroom. I froze instantly, my hand still on the handle, my exhausted brain struggling to process what I was hearing. Daniel's voice, clear and strong. Not the weak rasp of a sick man but the full, robust tone of someone in perfect health. And a woman's voice, equally clear, speaking in the intimate, comfortable cadence of someone very familiar with the person they were addressing. I stood absolutely still in the hallway, my heart beginning to hammer in my chest, and listened to my husband having a conversation with a woman in our bedroom at 4:30 in the morning, while I had spent the night working to support us financially during his supposed illness. The woman spoke first, her voice carrying easily through the door I had not yet opened. She said something about how much longer they needed to maintain the charade, using language that suggested this was an ongoing discussion they had engaged in many times before. Daniel responded with that laugh, that genuine healthy laugh that demolished in an instant every assumption I had made about the previous 3 months of our lives. He was not sick. The pneumonia, the weakness, the dependence, the gratitude for my care, all of it had been a performance. And I had been so thoroughly convinced by that performance that I had restructured my entire life around supporting an illness that apparently did not exist. I remained frozen in that hallway, my hand still on the door handle, my mind racing to catch up with a reality that had shifted completely in the space of a few overheard sentences. Every instinct told me to throw open that door, to confront whatever was happening on the other side, to demand immediate answers to the thousands of questions suddenly flooding my consciousness. But something stopped me. Perhaps it was my scientific training, my instinct to gather complete information before drawing conclusions. Perhaps it was shock paralyzing my ability to act. Perhaps it was the terrible certainty that once I opened that door, once I confronted whatever truth waited on the other side, there would be no going back to the life I had believed I was living just moments before. So I stood there in the darkness of my own hallway in the home I had purchased with my earnings, listening to my husband speak with perfect health and energy to a woman whose presence in our bedroom at this hour could mean only one thing, and I made a decision that would determine everything that followed. I did not open the door. Not yet. Instead, I pulled my hand back slowly, careful not to make any sound that would alert them to my presence. I backed away from the bedroom door with the same caution, placing each foot deliberately to avoid any creaking floorboards that might betray me. I retreated down the hallway to the guest bathroom, stepped inside, and closed the door silently behind me. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone. The screen light seemed blindingly bright in the darkness. I opened the voice recording application I used for capturing notes during client calls and pressed record. Then I returned to the hallway, positioned myself near enough to the bedroom door that my phone would capture the conversation clearly, and I listened while technology documented every word of the truth that was destroying everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and the life we had supposedly built together. What I heard in those next 17 minutes would prove to be just the beginning of discoveries that would reveal a betrayal far more extensive and calculated than a simple affair. But in that moment, standing in the pre-dawn darkness of my own home, exhausted from a night of work I had completed to support us during a medical crisis that apparently never existed, I understood that everything I believed about my life had been a carefully constructed lie. And the man I had married, the man I had cared for with such dedication and concern, the man I had trusted completely, was someone I did not know at all. The woman's voice came through clearly as I held my phone steady near the bedroom door. The recording application capturing every word with the clinical precision I had once applied only to research data. She was asking Daniel how much longer he planned to maintain what she called the sick routine before they could move forward with their plans. Her tone carried no guilt, no hesitation, only the practical impatience of someone discussing a business timeline that had extended beyond its original projection. Daniel's response made my stomach turn. He explained that he needed at least another month, maybe 6 weeks, to ensure everything was positioned correctly. He spoke about my consulting business with an intimate knowledge that shocked me, referencing specific clients by name, discussing the valuation of my firm with figures that were accurate to a degree that could only come from accessing confidential financial records I had never shared with him. He mentioned that my recent intensive project had been perfect timing because it had kept me distracted and exhausted, too depleted to notice inconsistencies in his supposed illness or to ask probing questions about his condition. The woman, whose name I learned was Melissa when Daniel addressed her directly, asked about his concern that I might grow suspicious. Daniel laughed again, that same healthy, vibrant laugh that contained not a trace of the weakness he had displayed so convincingly for months. He told her there was no risk of that. He described me as brilliant with data and research but completely naive about people, someone whose logical mind made her easy to deceive because she approached human relationships with the same assumption of good faith she applied to scientific inquiry. He said I trusted documentation and evidence, so he had simply provided the evidence I needed to believe what he wanted me to believe. He detailed how he had researched pneumonia symptoms thoroughly, studied patient recovery timelines, and even consulted with a friend who worked as a physician's assistant to understand exactly how a severe case would present and progress. He had timed his fever spikes to coincide with when I would be checking on him. He had practiced the rattling cough until it sounded genuinely alarming. He had lost weight deliberately through restricted eating on days when I was traveling for client meetings, then maintained that lower weight to create visible evidence of illness. Every aspect of his performance had been calculated and rehearsed. Melissa asked what he had been doing during the days when I believed he was resting in our bedroom. Daniel's answer revealed a parallel life I had been completely unaware of. He had been leaving the house shortly after I became absorbed in work each morning, spending his days at Melissa's apartment across town, and returning in the early evening in time to resume his sick patient routine before I emerged from my office. On the days when I had been most intensively focused on client work, he had not even bothered to return during daylight hours, confident that my concentration would prevent me from checking on him until evening. The scope of the deception was staggering. This was not an impulsive affair or a recent lapse in judgment. This had been planned, executed, and maintained with extraordinary discipline over a period of months. Every moment of concern I had felt, every night I had lost sleep worrying about his health, Every client meeting I had rescheduled to stay home and monitor his condition had been manufactured by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate my natural caregiving instincts and medical knowledge. But the affair itself, as devastating as that betrayal was, turned out to be merely the foundation for something far more calculated. Melissa shifted the conversation to what she called the business side of things, and Daniel's tone changed from casual to focused. He began discussing my consulting firm with the detailed knowledge of someone who had been studying it as thoroughly as I had studied clinical trial protocols. He explained to Melissa that my business was worth substantially more than I realized. He had been reviewing my financial records, client contracts, and proprietary methodologies for over a year. He had identified that my 3 employees were capable of maintaining client relationships and executing projects without my direct involvement, which meant the business had value beyond my personal expertise. He had researched comparable sales of boutique consulting firms in the pharmaceutical sector and determined that my company could sell for somewhere between $4 and $6 million to a larger consultancy looking to acquire my client base and methodologies. Melissa asked whether I would ever agree to sell the business I had built. Daniel's response was chilling in its casual confidence. He said I would not need to agree because he had been systematically positioning himself as a co-owner of the firm despite having never contributed anything to its operation or development. He explained that he had been forging documentation over the past 18 months, creating a paper trail that suggested he had been involved in the business from its inception, had contributed capital during its early growth phase, and had played an advisory role in major strategic decisions. He described in detail how he had created false email accounts that mimicked communications between himself and my employees, backdating messages to create the appearance of his involvement in client projects. He had forged amendments to our marriage's financial agreements that designated my consulting income as community property rather than separate business assets. He had even filed false partnership documents with the state business registry, listing himself as a 50% owner of my firm, using forged signatures that he admitted had taken him multiple attempts to execute convincingly. The goal, he explained to Melissa, was to create sufficient documentation that in the event of divorce, he could claim ownership of half my business. Even if I challenged the forged documents, the legal battle would be expensive and time-consuming enough that I would likely agree to a settlement that gave him several $1 million just to avoid prolonged litigation. And if I somehow managed to prove the forgeries, he had created enough complexity in our finances over the years of our marriage that he could still claim substantial marital assets based on community property laws. But Daniel's plan extended beyond simply positioning himself to claim half my business in divorce. He had been actively preparing to sell the company out from under me. He told Melissa that he had already been in preliminary discussions with 2 larger consulting firms about acquiring my business. He had represented himself as my business partner, provided them with confidential information about my client base and revenues, and negotiated terms for a potential sale. His plan was to force a sale by claiming partnership authority, execute the transaction before I could legally block it, and disappear with his portion of the proceeds before the forgeries could be thoroughly investigated. The timeline he described to Melissa was horrifyingly specific. He needed to maintain his sick routine for another month to 6 weeks because he was waiting for one of the potential acquiring companies to complete their due diligence and present a formal offer. Once that offer was received, he would suddenly experience what he called a miraculous recovery from his pneumonia, announce that his health crisis had made him reevaluate his priorities, and inform me that he had received an unexpected offer to purchase the consulting firm that he thought we should seriously consider. He anticipated that I would be resistant to selling a business I had built and loved. That was where Melissa came in. She worked in commercial real estate law, and Daniel had been using her expertise to structure the potential sale in ways that would be difficult for me to legally challenge. She had helped him identify exactly which documents needed to be forged, had reviewed his fabricated email communications to ensure they would withstand initial scrutiny, and had advised him on how to create the appearance of legitimate business partnership despite his complete lack of actual involvement in my company's operations. Melissa asked what would happen if I discovered the truth before the sale could be completed. Daniel's response revealed the full extent of his calculation and his assessment of my character. He said there was virtually no risk of that because I was too trusting, too focused on my work, and too decent to imagine that someone would construct such an elaborate deception. He said that even if I stumbled across evidence that something was wrong, I would likely give him the benefit of the doubt, seek a reasonable explanation, and accept whatever story he constructed because that was how my logical, good-faith mind operated. He added with casual cruelty that took my breath away, that my dedication to caring for him during his fake illness had actually made his deception easier. Every moment I spent bringing him meals, administering medications, and monitoring symptoms that did not exist was time I was not spending reviewing financial records or questioning the legitimacy of business documents I had never signed. My compassion had been weaponized against me with stunning effectiveness. The conversation shifted to their plans for after the business sale was completed. Daniel and Melissa had apparently been planning their future together with the same meticulous attention to detail that Daniel had applied to forging business documents. They discussed purchasing property in Portland, where Melissa had connections in the legal community, and where they could establish themselves with the proceeds from selling my business. Daniel mentioned that he expected to walk away with at least $2 million after legal fees, and the various steps necessary to conceal the fraudulent nature of the transaction. Melissa expressed some concern about potential criminal charges if the forgeries were discovered after the sale. Daniel dismissed this worry with disturbing confidence. He explained that corporate fraud cases were difficult to prosecute, especially when they involved disputes between spouses that could be characterized as civil divorce matters rather than criminal activity. He said that even in the worst-case scenario where I somehow proved the forgeries and reported him to authorities, he would already have the money transferred to accounts I could not access, and the legal process of recovering those funds would take years if it succeeded at all. He had researched asset protection strategies, consulted with Melissa about structuring financial transfers to minimize traceability, and prepared multiple contingency plans for different scenarios that might unfold. This was not impulsive theft driven by desperate need. This was systematic asset stripping executed by someone who had studied how to exploit the legal system, manipulate personal relationships, and disappear with stolen wealth before consequences could catch up with him. As I listened to Daniel describe these plans with the same analytical thoroughness I brought to designing clinical trials, I felt something shift inside me. The initial shock and pain of discovering his infidelity was being rapidly overtaken by a cold, clarifying anger. This man had studied me like a research subject, identified my weaknesses and blind spots, and designed an experiment to systematically extract maximum value from the life I had built before discarding me entirely. He had taken my trust, my compassion, my dedication to caring for someone I loved during illness, and transformed all of it into tactical advantages in a scheme to steal everything I had worked years to create. He had lied so comprehensively that even my medical knowledge had been turned against me, used to make me believe in an illness sophisticated enough to fool someone who understood disease progression. He had performed emotional vulnerability and physical weakness with such commitment that I had never questioned the authenticity of what I was witnessing. The recording on my phone continued capturing their conversation as they moved on to discussing smaller details of their planning, debating whether Daniel should stage one more dramatic symptom episode to justify another round of expensive medical testing that would reinforce the illusion of serious illness. Melissa thought it was unnecessary risk, but Daniel argued that maintaining absolute consistency in his sick performance was what had made the deception successful so far, and any deviation might trigger my suspicion at a critical moment when they were so close to completing the business sale. I had heard enough to understand the essential truth of my situation. My husband had spent at least 18 months, possibly longer, preparing to steal my business through forgery and fraud. He had faked a serious illness to keep me distracted during the crucial final phase of his planning. He was involved with another woman who was actively assisting in structuring the theft to minimize legal consequences. And he viewed me with such contempt that he openly discussed my naivety and gullibility while sitting in the bedroom of the home I had purchased with my earnings. The recording application on my phone showed that 17 minutes had elapsed since I began documenting their conversation. My hands had stopped shaking. The initial shock had burned away, replaced by something colder and more focused. I stopped the recording, saved the file with a date and timestamp, and immediately uploaded it to 3 separate cloud storage services to ensure it could not be lost or destroyed. Then I backed away from the bedroom door with the same silent caution I had used to approach it. I moved down the hallway to the guest room at the opposite end of our house, closed the door quietly, and sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness. Dawn was beginning to break outside, pale gray light filtering through the window blinds. I had been awake for over 24 hours, working through the night to complete a client project for a business my husband was actively planning to steal. I needed to think clearly despite the exhaustion and emotional devastation. My scientific training provided a framework for that clarity. I mentally organized what I knew into categories, the same way I would structure analysis of complex clinical trial data. Evidence collected. 17 minutes of recorded conversation documenting infidelity, business fraud, forgery, and planned asset theft. Immediate threats. Forged partnership documents that might give Daniel legal standing to force a business sale. Timeline pressure. Daniel planned to execute his scheme within the next month to 6 weeks once he received a formal acquisition offer. My advantages. Daniel believed I was completely unaware of his deception. He thought I was too trusting and too focused on work to notice what he was doing. He had no idea I had discovered the truth, which meant I had time to prepare a response before he realized his planning had been compromised. But I also recognized my vulnerabilities. I was a scientist and consultant, not a lawyer or investigator. I did not know how to prove forgery, protect my business assets from fraudulent claims, or navigate the criminal justice system. I was exhausted from days of intensive work, and from the emotional impact of discovering that my marriage was a calculated fraud. I was alone in my house with a man who had demonstrated his willingness to lie, forge documents, and steal with extraordinary commitment and skill. I needed help, and I needed it from someone I could trust absolutely. I pulled out my phone again and scrolled through my contacts, looking for the name of the one person whose judgment and loyalty I had never questioned. My older sister Caroline lived in Portland, ironically the same city where Daniel and Melissa were planning to relocate with the proceeds from stealing my business. Caroline was an attorney, though her practice focused on environmental law, rather than corporate fraud or family law. But she would know who to contact, how to protect my interests, and how to help me navigate this situation strategically rather than emotionally. It was just after 5 in the morning, too early to call under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances. I pressed her number and listened to the phone ring, wondering how I would even begin to explain what I had just discovered. Caroline answered on the third ring, her voice thick with sleep and immediate concern because she knew I would not call at this hour unless something was seriously wrong. I kept my voice low and steady, not wanting to risk being overheard by Daniel or Melissa in the bedroom down the hall. I told Caroline that I needed her help with a legal and personal crisis, that I could not explain everything over the phone, but that I had discovered my husband was planning to steal my business through fraud and forgery. I told her I had documentation that time was critical, and that I needed guidance on how to protect myself and everything I had built. Caroline's response was immediate and clear. She told me not to confront Daniel, not to let him know I had discovered anything, and to act completely normal until we could formulate a comprehensive strategy. She said she would catch the earliest flight to Seattle that morning, would contact attorney colleagues who specialized in corporate fraud and asset protection, and would help me build a response that would protect both my business and my legal position. She asked if I was safe in the house with Daniel. I considered the question carefully. I did not believe Daniel posed a physical threat, but I also would never have believed he would forge business documents and fake a serious illness to steal from me. I told Caroline I would leave the house shortly after dawn, would check into a hotel, and would wait for her there. She approved this plan and told me to bring any business records or financial documents I could access quickly without arousing suspicion. We ended the call after she made me promise to contact her immediately if anything changed or if I felt unsafe. I sat in the guest room for several more minutes, forcing myself to breathe slowly and think methodically. I needed to leave the house without alerting Daniel that anything had changed. That meant I needed to appear normal, needed to perform the same exhausted but caring wife routine I had been maintaining throughout his fake illness. I stood up slowly, my body aching from fatigue and tension. I walked quietly to my home office and gathered essential items, including my laptop which contained backup copies of all my business files, financial records for both my consulting firm and our household accounts, and client contracts that would be crucial for establishing my sole ownership of the business. I packed these materials into my work bag along with backup drives, and the external storage devices where I maintained encrypted copies of proprietary methodologies that represented years of development and refinement. Then I returned to the guest room and packed a small overnight bag with clothes and toiletries, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had made this same type of quick travel preparation countless times for client meetings. When everything was ready, I carried my bags downstairs to the kitchen, set them by the back door, and prepared myself for the performance I needed to give. I walked upstairs to our bedroom door and knocked softly, the same gentle knock I had used countless times over the past months when checking on Daniel's condition. I heard sudden movement inside, quick and alert rather than the slow stirring of someone genuinely ill. Then Daniel's voice, weak and strained with impressive speed, telling me to come in. I opened the door to find our bedroom exactly as it should appear if Daniel had been sleeping alone. Melissa had apparently left through the sliding door that opened onto our small second-floor balcony. The same door I now noticed had been left slightly ajar in her hasty departure. Daniel was in bed, positioned in the same exhausted sprawl he had perfected over months of performance, his face arranged in the expression of someone who had spent another difficult night battling persistent illness. I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing except cold assessment. This was not my husband. This was an adversary who had studied me to identify exploitable weaknesses, and I needed to ensure he continued to believe his study had been accurate. I arranged my face into an expression of tired concern and asked how he was feeling. He gave me the response he had given dozens of times before, describing how his sleep had been restless, how his breathing still felt labored, how grateful he was that I was there to take care of him. I told him I had just finished my intensive client project and was completely exhausted. I said I was going to get a hotel room for the day, so I could sleep without worrying about disturbing him with my movements or alarm clocks. I explained that I needed uninterrupted rest to recover from the demanding work I had just completed, and I knew he needed the same quiet environment to continue his recovery. I would check on him tomorrow once I had rested, and we could discuss his upcoming doctor's appointment then. Daniel looked relieved at this news, though he covered it with expressions of concern about whether I should spend money on a hotel when I could rest at home. I assured him it was fine, that the intensive project had paid extremely well, and that I wanted us both to get the rest we needed. He accepted this explanation with the same trusting ease with which I had accepted his fake illness, and I felt a grim satisfaction at turning his own tactics back on him. I told him I loved him, the lie coming easily because it was just words now with no emotional weight behind them. He returned the sentiment with practiced warmth. Then I left the bedroom, collected my bags from downstairs, and walked out of the house as the sun rose over Seattle. I drove to a hotel near the airport, checked in under my own name without attempting to hide my location because Daniel believed I was simply getting rest after intense work, and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what I had discovered. I sat in that anonymous hotel room and understood that my marriage was over, that the man I had trusted completely had never existed except as a character Daniel performed to gain access to my assets, and that I was facing a fight to protect everything I had built from someone who had spent years preparing to take it from me. But I also understood something else. Daniel had made a critical miscalculation. He had studied my professional expertise, my trusting nature, and my dedication to helping people I loved. But he had failed to recognize that the same analytical skills I applied to complex research problems could be redirected toward documenting evidence, building cases, and systematically dismantling fraudulent schemes. He thought my decency was weakness. He would learn it was something far more dangerous when combined with the intelligence and thoroughness he had completely underestimated. The game he thought he was winning had just changed in ways he could not yet imagine, and I had advantages he did not know existed. My sister would arrive within hours. Together we would build a strategy, and Daniel's carefully constructed plan to steal my life would become the evidence that destroyed everything he hoped to gain. Caroline arrived at my hotel room at 11:30 that morning, having caught the first available flight from Portland. She looked at me with the kind of concern that comes from knowing someone their entire life and recognizing when everything fundamental has shifted. I had not slept despite my exhaustion. Instead, I had spent the hours since leaving my house organizing everything I knew into a coherent timeline, documenting the events of the past 3 months, alongside the recorded conversation that had revealed the truth behind those events. My sister sat down across from me at the small hotel room desk where I had spread out printed financial documents, business records, and my laptop displaying the audio file that contained Daniel's conversation with Melissa. She listened without interruption as I walked her through everything that had happened, starting with Daniel's initial pneumonia diagnosis in December, and ending with my decision to leave the house that morning without confronting him. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her expression shifting from shock to anger to the same cold analytical focus I had felt settling over myself. Caroline had built her career on methodical preparation and strategic thinking. Environmental law required navigating complex regulatory frameworks, anticipating opposition moves, and building airtight cases that could withstand intense scrutiny. She approached my situation with that same systematic methodology. Her first question was whether I had secured all critical documentation. I showed her the backup drives containing my business files, the encrypted cloud storage where I had uploaded the recorded conversation, and the financial records I had gathered before leaving the house. She nodded approvingly and then asked about the forged documents Daniel had mentioned in his conversation with Melissa. I explained that I had no physical evidence of those forgeries yet because I had not known they existed until I overheard Daniel describing them. Caroline made notes on her tablet, already building what she called an investigation and protection strategy. She told me we needed to work on parallel tracks simultaneously. First, we had to secure my business assets and personal finances against any fraudulent claims Daniel might attempt to execute. Second, we needed to gather evidence of his forgeries and fraud that would hold up in both civil and criminal proceedings. Third, we had to do all of this without alerting Daniel that I had discovered his scheme until we were fully prepared to act. Caroline made several phone calls over the next hour, speaking with attorney colleagues who specialized in areas relevant to my situation. She contacted a corporate litigation specialist named Marcus Chun, who had extensive experience with business fraud cases. She reached out to a forensic accountant named Patricia Okonkwo, who could analyze financial records to identify unauthorized transactions and forged documentation. She also called a family law attorney named Rebecca Hartwell, who handled high-asset divorces involving business ownership disputes. By early afternoon, we had assembled what Caroline described as our core team. Each of these professionals agreed to meet with us that evening at Marcus Chen's law office in downtown Seattle. Caroline explained to each of them the basic outline of my situation, the urgency created by Daniel's timeline for executing the business sale, and the need for absolute confidentiality. All three immediately grasped the seriousness of what we were dealing with and cleared their schedules to prioritize my case. While we waited for the evening meeting, Caroline and I worked through the practical immediate steps I needed to take. She advised me to access my business bank accounts and transfer sufficient operating funds to a new account that only I controlled, protecting the company's ability to function if Daniel attempted to freeze or drain existing accounts. I logged into my firm's financial systems and executed those transfers, documenting every transaction with screenshots and confirmation emails. Caroline also instructed me to change all passwords associated with my business email, client management systems, financial accounts, and cloud storage services. She explained that if Daniel had been creating forged email communications, he likely had access to my actual business systems and could potentially delete evidence or create additional fraudulent documentation if he realized I had discovered his scheme. I spent 2 hours systematically updating security credentials across every platform my consulting firm used, implementing two-factor authentication wherever possible, and documenting the previous access logs to see if there was evidence of unauthorized entry. The access logs revealed exactly what Caroline had suspected. Daniel's IP address appeared regularly in the login history for my business email system, my client database, and my financial management software. The timestamps corresponded to periods when I had been traveling for client meetings or intensively focused on project work. He had been systematically accessing my business systems for at least 14 months, far longer than the 18-month timeline he had mentioned to Melissa. This suggested his planning had been even more extensive than the conversation I had recorded had revealed. Caroline photographed each access log, noting the dates, times, and IP addresses. She explained that this evidence would be crucial for demonstrating that Daniel's access to my business information had been unauthorized, and that any documents he claimed to have legitimately would be revealed as products of that unauthorized access. The pattern of his activity showed clear intent and premeditation rather than innocent spousal interest in my work. At 6 that evening, we arrived at Marcus Chen's law office in a modern building overlooking Elliott Bay. Marcus was in his late 40s with the calm, measured demeanor of someone who had navigated countless high-stakes legal battles. Patricia Okonkwo, the forensic accountant, was younger and projected an intensity that suggested she approached financial analysis with the same passion others might reserve for creative pursuits. Rebecca Hartwell, the family law specialist, had a reputation for aggressive advocacy that Caroline assured me would be essential given what we were facing. We gathered in Marcus's conference room, and I walked the entire team through my situation once again, this time providing access to all the documentation I had assembled. I played the recorded conversation between Daniel and Melissa, watching the attorney's expressions shift from professional interest to genuine anger, as they heard Daniel describe his fraud scheme with such casual confidence. When the recording ended, Marcus was the first to speak. He told me directly that what I had documented was clear evidence of multiple serious crimes, including business fraud, forgery, identity theft, and potentially wire fraud if Daniel had used electronic communications to facilitate his scheme. Beyond the criminal implications, Marcus explained that the recorded conversation and the access logs I had gathered provided an extraordinary foundation for civil litigation to protect my business and personal assets. He said that in his 20 years of practicing corporate law, he had rarely seen a case where the evidence of fraudulent intent was this comprehensive and this clearly documented. Patricia asked to examine my business financial records in detail. I provided her with access to my accounting systems, bank statements, and tax returns for both my consulting firm and our household finances. She began her analysis immediately, her fingers moving rapidly across her laptop keyboard as she pulled data into forensic accounting software designed to identify anomalies, unauthorized transactions, and patterns of financial manipulation. Rebecca focused on the marital asset questions, asking detailed questions about what property Daniel and I owned jointly versus separately, how my consulting business had been structured from its inception, and whether there had been any prenuptial or postnuptial agreements. I explained that we had not signed a prenuptial agreement because when we married, I was just beginning to consider launching my consulting firm and had minimal assets. My business had been established 2 years into our marriage, funded entirely by a small business loan I had personally guaranteed and early consulting fees I had earned. Daniel had never contributed capital, expertise, or labor to the firm's creation or operation. Rebecca nodded thoughtfully and explained that this timeline and structure would normally make my consulting business my separate property, rather than marital community property under Washington state law. However, she cautioned that Daniel's forged documents were presumably designed to create the appearance that he had been involved from the beginning, or had contributed in ways that would transform the business into a marital asset subject to division. She said our challenge would be proving those documents were fraudulent before a family court judge, who might be inclined to accept them at face value absent clear evidence of forgery. Marcus outlined what he called our three-phase strategy. Phase 1 involved immediate asset protection, freezing any accounts or property that Daniel might attempt to access or encumber with fraudulent claims. Phase 2 required comprehensive evidence gathering to document every aspect of Daniel's fraud scheme, including identifying and securing the forged documents he had mentioned, interviewing potential witnesses, and building a complete timeline of his activities. Phase 3 would be coordinated legal action, filing both criminal complaints and civil litigation designed to protect my interests while ensuring Daniel faced appropriate consequences for his actions. He cautioned that we needed to move quickly, because Daniel's timeline for executing the business sale was compressed. If one of the companies he had been negotiating with presented a formal acquisition offer, he might attempt to move forward immediately, potentially creating legal complications that would be far more difficult to unwind after the fact than to prevent proactively. Marcus recommended that we aim to have our asset protection measures in place within 48 hours and our evidence gathering substantially complete within 1 week. Patricia looked up from her laptop with an expression that combined satisfaction and disgust. She reported that her preliminary analysis had already identified multiple suspicious transactions in our household accounts that warranted deeper investigation. She had found regular transfers from our joint checking account to external accounts I did not recognize, totaling approximately $87,000 over the past 2 years. The transfers were modest amounts, typically between $1,500 and $3,000, spaced irregularly to avoid creating an obvious pattern. She also identified that someone had established a business credit line in my consulting firm's name approximately 11 months ago, secured against the company's accounts receivable. The credit line had a limit of $250,000 and currently showed an outstanding balance of $193,000. I had never authorized this credit line, had never received any documentation about it, and had no knowledge of how the borrowed funds had been used. Patricia explained that establishing this credit line would have required forged financial documents and falsified authorization, representing clear criminal fraud. Rebecca asked whether I had ever signed any documents without reading them carefully, wondering if Daniel might claim I had unknowingly authorized some of these transactions. I told her absolutely not. My scientific training and professional work had made me meticulous about reviewing any document before signing it. I had never signed blank forms, never authorized Daniel to sign on my behalf, and never delegated financial decision-making for my business to anyone. Every contract, every bank document, every legal filing related to my consulting firm had been personally reviewed and signed by me alone. Caroline interjected with a question about Melissa's involvement and potential legal exposure. Marcus explained that if Melissa had knowingly assisted Daniel in structuring fraudulent transactions or had provided legal advice to facilitate criminal activity, she could face both criminal charges and professional consequences, including disbarment. He recommended that we identify Melissa's full name and her law firm affiliation, so we could potentially use the threat of professional discipline as leverage to secure her cooperation in providing evidence against Daniel. I realized I did not know Melissa's last name or where she worked. The recorded conversation had only included her first name. Marcus asked if I could access Daniel's phone records or email to identify her contact information. I explained that I did not have access to Daniel's personal phone or email accounts. However, I remembered that he sometimes used our home computer for personal correspondence. If he had been careless about security on that shared device, there might be accessible information. Caroline immediately recognized the value of that potential evidence source. She asked if I could remotely access our home computer's files. I explained that I had set up a comprehensive backup system for our household computers that automatically synchronized files to cloud storage. If Daniel had used our home computer to communicate with Melissa or to work on forged documents, those files might exist in the backup system I could access from anywhere. I logged into the cloud backup service and began searching through files synchronized from our home computer. Within minutes, I found a folder Daniel had apparently believed was hidden, labeled with an innocuous name that suggested it contained old tax documents. Inside that folder were draft versions of the forged partnership agreements he had mentioned to Melissa, email exchanges between Daniel and Melissa discussing the fraud scheme, and correspondence between Daniel and 2 consulting firms about potential acquisition of my business. The team gathered around my laptop as I opened each file. The forged partnership documents were sophisticated, mimicking the formatting and language of legitimate legal agreements. They claimed to establish Daniel as a 50% partner in my consulting firm, with provisions stating he had contributed initial capital and ongoing business expertise. The signatures on these documents were forgeries of my signature, executed with enough skill that they might pass casual inspection. The emails between Daniel and Melissa were even more damaging. They discussed the forgery process in explicit detail, with Melissa providing guidance on which specific language to include in the false partnership documents to make them appear legitimate. She advised him on how to backdate the agreements to make them appear to have been executed during the early years of my business. She even provided him with the name of a notary public, who she said could be persuaded to improperly notarize documents without properly verifying identity. Most significantly, the emails included Melissa's full name, her law firm affiliation, and her bar license number that appeared in her email signature. Melissa Sullivan was an associate attorney at a mid-sized commercial law firm in Seattle, specializing in real estate transactions and business formation. Her involvement in advising Daniel on how to commit fraud represented a spectacular ethical violation that would certainly result in professional discipline and likely disbarment if reported to the State Bar Association. The correspondence with potential acquiring companies revealed that Daniel had represented himself as my business partner and co-owner with authority to negotiate a sale. He had provided the companies with confidential financial information about my firm's revenues, client base, and profit margins. He had discussed valuation ranges and proposed deal structures. Both companies had expressed serious interest, with one indicating they would present a formal offer within 3 to 4 weeks, a timeline that aligned exactly with what Daniel had told Melissa in the conversation I had recorded. Marcus photographed every document displayed on my laptop screen, ensuring we had comprehensive evidence, even if Daniel somehow managed to delete the original files. He explained that this cache of documents was extraordinarily valuable because it demonstrated clear premeditation, detailed planning, and collaboration with another party who had professional legal expertise. The involvement of an attorney in structuring the fraud would make it much harder for Daniel to claim the entire scheme was a misunderstanding or a marital dispute rather than criminal activity. Rebecca pointed out that the emails discussing forgery techniques and the actual draft forged documents would make it nearly impossible for Daniel to argue he had acted in good faith or had believed he had legitimate authority to claim ownership of my business. The level of detail in his planning and the explicit discussion of creating false documentation eliminated any possible defense based on misunderstanding or different interpretations of marital property rights. Patricia noted something else in the financial records I had accessed. Daniel had established a limited liability company in his name alone, approximately 8 months ago. The LLC's stated business purpose was consulting services, vague enough to potentially encompass the type of work my firm performed. She speculated that Daniel might have been planning to use this entity to receive proceeds from the fraudulent sale of my business, creating a layer of separation between himself and the stolen funds that would complicate asset recovery efforts. Caroline asked the critical strategic question that was on everyone's mind. Given the comprehensive evidence we had already gathered and the clear criminal nature of Daniel's actions, should we immediately contact law enforcement and have him arrested, or should we continue gathering evidence while maintaining the pretense that I remained unaware of his scheme? The room fell silent as the team considered the implications of each approach. Marcus spoke first, outlining the advantages of immediate criminal complaint filing. Arresting Daniel would prevent him from executing his planned business sale, would freeze his activities while investigation proceeded, and would send a clear message that his actions carried serious consequences. However, Marcus also noted the disadvantages. Once Daniel was arrested, he would immediately retain criminal defense counsel, who would advise him to stop communicating about the fraud. We would lose the opportunity to potentially gather additional evidence through his continued unguarded actions and statements. Rebecca offered the family law perspective. If we moved immediately to arrest, we would also need to simultaneously file for divorce and seek emergency court orders protecting my business assets. This would transform the situation into open warfare with Daniel fighting aggressively on both criminal and civil fronts. Alternatively, if we maintain the pretense of normalcy for a brief additional period, we could thoroughly prepare our civil asset protection strategy, identify and secure all evidence, and potentially position ourselves to resolve both the criminal and civil aspects more favorably. Patricia suggested a middle approach. We could take immediate steps to protect my business assets through confidential legal mechanisms that would not alert Daniel, while continuing to monitor his activities and gather additional evidence for approximately 1 week. This would give us time to implement comprehensive asset protection, while preserving the strategic advantage of Daniel, believing his scheme remained undiscovered. Caroline looked at me and asked what I felt was the right approach. I considered the question carefully, thinking about the different dimensions of what I was facing. Part of me wanted Daniel arrested immediately, wanted him to feel the same shock and betrayal I had experienced when I discovered his fraud. But the more analytical part of my mind recognized that strategic patience would serve my interests better than emotional satisfaction. I told the team I wanted to pursue the middle approach Patricia had suggested. I wanted to use the next week to thoroughly secure my business, gather every possible piece of evidence, and prepare for coordinated action that would protect my interests while ensuring Daniel faced full consequences for what he had done. I explained that Daniel had spent months performing his sick routine with extraordinary discipline and patience. I could perform my own routine of the unknowing wife for 1 more week if it meant the difference between partial justice and complete protection of everything I had built. Marcus nodded approvingly and said that decision demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking that would serve me well in the legal battles ahead. He outlined our timeline. Over the next 7 days, we would implement emergency asset protection measures, conduct a complete forensic analysis of all financial records, secure copies of any forged documents we could identify, interview potential witnesses who might have information about Daniel's activities, and prepare comprehensive filings for both criminal complaints and civil litigation. He assigned specific responsibilities to each team member. Patricia would complete her forensic accounting analysis and prepare detailed reports documenting every unauthorized transaction and forged financial instrument. Rebecca would draft divorce filings and emergency motions to protect business assets, ready to file immediately when we decided to move forward. Caroline would coordinate with the Washington State Bar Association to prepare a complaint against Melissa Sullivan for her role in advising criminal activity. Marcus himself would work with a private investigator to gather additional evidence about Daniel's activities and to identify the notary public who Melissa had suggested could be persuaded to improperly notarize fraudulent documents. My role was perhaps the most challenging. I needed to return home, resume caring for Daniel during his fake illness, and maintain absolute normalcy while knowing everything I now knew about his betrayal and fraud. I needed to perform trust and concern with the same skill Daniel had performed weakness and illness. I needed to ensure he suspected nothing until we were completely prepared to act. Caroline saw the expression on my face and squeezed my hand. She told me I was stronger than I realized, that the same intelligence and discipline that had built my successful consulting practice would carry me through this deception. She reminded me that I was not lying to protect myself at someone else's expense. I was gathering evidence to prevent a criminal from stealing what I had legitimately earned and built. The meeting concluded near midnight with clear assignments for each team member, and a scheduled conference call for 3 days later to assess progress and refine our strategy. As I left Marcus's office with Caroline, I felt something I had not expected to feel given the circumstances. I felt focused clarity about the path ahead. Daniel had planned his fraud with meticulous care. We would dismantle his scheme with even greater precision. Caroline stayed with me that night at the hotel, unwilling to let me face the emotional weight of what lay ahead without family support. We talked until nearly 3 a.m. about everything that had happened, about the signs I had missed, about the man I thought I had married versus the reality of who Daniel actually was. My sister listened without judgment, understanding that I needed to process not just the practical legal challenges, but the profound personal betrayal that accompanied them. The next morning, I prepared to return home and resume the performance Daniel expected to see. Caroline helped me rehearse responses to potential questions about where I had been, what I had been doing, and how I was feeling. We practiced maintaining neutral facial expressions while discussing Daniel's supposed illness, my consulting work, and our future plans. Caroline reminded me that I should avoid asking questions that might suggest suspicion, while being receptive to any information Daniel volunteered that could provide additional evidence of his scheme. I drove back to my house mid-morning, carrying the same bags I had left with and wearing an expression of exhausted relief at having gotten the rest I claimed to need. Daniel was downstairs when I arrived, looking weak and moving slowly in his performance of continued illness. He greeted me with what appeared to be genuine happiness at my return, asking about my rest and expressing concern that I had felt the need to leave for an entire day just to sleep properly. I gave him the responses we had prepared. I explained that the intense work project had completely depleted me, and that I had needed uninterrupted rest to recover. I told him I felt much better now, and was ready to focus on taking care of him again. I asked about how he had been feeling during my absence, whether he had eaten properly, whether his symptoms had changed. Daniel provided the expected update about his supposed condition, describing a night of difficult breathing and persistent cough, claiming he had barely been able to manage basic self-care while I was away. I watched him perform these responses and felt absolutely nothing except clinical observation of his technique. He was genuinely skilled at this deception, maintaining consistency with previous symptom reports while introducing small variations that suggested realistic disease progression. If I had not overheard his conversation with Melissa, if I did not know with absolute certainty that his illness was fabricated, I would have found his performance completely convincing. Over the following days, I maintained that same detached observation while performing my role as the concerned wife. I brought Daniel meals and medications, asked about his comfort, and discussed his upcoming doctor's appointment with apparent genuine concern for his recovery. Meanwhile, I received daily updates from the legal team about their progress securing evidence, and preparing our coordinated response. Patricia completed her forensic analysis and identified additional unauthorized transactions beyond what she had initially discovered, bringing the total amount of money Daniel had stolen or fraudulently borrowed to approximately $360,000. Rebecca prepared comprehensive divorce filings that included emergency motions to freeze all marital assets and to establish my sole ownership of the consulting firm pending full litigation. Caroline filed the bar complaint against Melissa Sullivan with supporting documentation that made her ethical violations impossible to deny. Marcus's private investigator located the notary public Melissa had mentioned in her emails to Daniel. The investigator obtained a statement from the notary admitting that Melissa Sullivan had paid him to notarize documents without properly verifying the identity of signatories, a serious crime that would result in criminal charges for both the notary and Melissa. This admission provided additional evidence of the conspiracy between Daniel and Melissa to create fraudulent documentation. On the 6th day after I had discovered Daniel's scheme, Marcus called to inform me that his investigator had confirmed one of the companies Daniel had approached was preparing to present a formal acquisition offer for my consulting firm. The offer was scheduled to be delivered to what they believed was Daniel's business email address within 48 hours. This represented the triggering event we had been anticipating. Once that offer arrived, Daniel would move quickly to attempt executing the fraudulent sale. Marcus recommended we move forward with coordinated legal action immediately, before the offer was formally presented. We scheduled our final strategy meeting for the following morning. That night, I lay in bed beside my husband, who I now knew had spent years planning to destroy everything I had built, and I felt perfectly calm. The fear and shock and pain of that first morning of discovery had been refined into something harder and more useful. Tomorrow we would act. Tomorrow Daniel would discover that the wife he had so thoroughly underestimated had spent the past week building a response that would dismantle his entire scheme and ensure he faced full consequences for every lie he had told and every document he had forged. Tomorrow his performance would end and mine would be revealed as having been far more convincing than his own. I thought about the 17 minutes of recorded conversation that had started this entire process. Daniel speaking with casual confidence about my naivety and trustworthiness, explaining to his accomplice why I would never discover his fraud. He had been wrong about my capacity to recognize betrayal. He would learn exactly how wrong he had been about everything else he thought he understood about the woman whose life he had tried to steal. The morning meeting at Marcus Chen's office began at 8 o'clock sharp. I had left the house while Daniel was still performing his routine of morning weakness, telling him I had an early client call that required privacy and focus. He had accepted this explanation without question, remaining convinced that my world revolved around the same predictable patterns he had observed and exploited for years. He could not have imagined that I was instead walking into a conference room where 4 legal professionals had spent the past week building a comprehensive strategy to dismantle every element of his fraud. Marcus opened the meeting by confirming what we had suspected. The acquisition offer from Stratton Consulting Group was scheduled to be transmitted to the email address Daniel had provided as his business contact within the next 24 hours. The offer would propose a purchase price of $4.7 million for my consulting firm, structured as an asset acquisition that would transfer my client relationships, proprietary methodologies, and business systems to Stratton's ownership. The proposed deal included immediate payment of 60% of the purchase price upon signing, with the remainder held in escrow pending successful client transition over a 6-month period. Marcus explained that this offer structure was actually favorable for preventing fraud because it required signatures from all legal owners before the transaction could proceed. If Daniel attempted to execute the sale using his forged partnership documents, Stratton's legal team would conduct verification of ownership as part of their due diligence process. This verification would expose Daniel's fraud before any money changed hands, protecting both me and Stratton from the consequences of a fraudulent transaction. However, Marcus cautioned that we should not rely on Stratton's due diligence to prevent the fraud. Daniel had been sophisticated enough in his planning that he might have prepared responses to standard verification procedures. More importantly, even if the Stratton deal failed due to discovered forgery, Daniel could attempt the same scheme with other potential acquirers, or could pivot to different fraudulent tactics. Our goal needed to be complete prevention of any fraudulent activity, combined with full accountability for the crimes Daniel had already committed. Patricia presented the results of her comprehensive forensic analysis. She had identified every unauthorized transaction, every forged financial instrument, and every fraudulent account Daniel had created over the past 2 years. The total financial impact of his theft and fraud exceeded $412,000 when accounting for stolen funds, fraudulently obtained credit, and interest charges on unauthorized loans. Beyond the direct financial theft, Patricia had documented that Daniel's activities had created substantial tax liability issues because he had failed to report the stolen funds as income, potentially exposing me to IRS audits and penalties if the situation was not properly resolved and documented. Patricia's analysis also revealed something more subtle, but equally important. Daniel had been systematically reviewing my client communications and project files, gathering intelligence about my business relationships and methodologies. He had created detailed summaries of my most valuable clients, noting contract renewal dates, pricing structures, and key relationship contacts. He had documented my proprietary approaches to clinical trial design with enough detail that someone could potentially replicate my methods. This intellectual property theft represented value that was difficult to quantify precisely, but was fundamental to my competitive advantage in the pharmaceutical consulting market. Rebecca outlined the divorce and asset protection strategy she had prepared. The filing would request immediate dissolution of marriage based on fraud and irretrievable breakdown of the marital relationship. More critically, it would include emergency motions requesting temporary restraining orders preventing Daniel from accessing any business accounts, from representing himself as having any ownership interest in my consulting firm, from contacting my clients or employees, and from disposing of or encumbering any marital assets pending full litigation. Rebecca explained that these emergency motions would be filed under seal to prevent Daniel from receiving advance notice that would allow him to hide assets or destroy evidence. We would request an expedited hearing within 72 hours where I would present evidence of Daniel's fraud to a family court judge. Based on the strength of our documentation, Rebecca was confident the temporary restraining orders would be granted, effectively freezing Daniel's ability to continue his fraudulent activities while the divorce proceeded. The divorce filing would also include a complete accounting of marital assets and a clear delineation of my consulting firm as separate property that I had created and built without any contribution from Daniel. We would present the forensic evidence of his unauthorized access to my business systems, his forged partnership documents, and his theft of funds as proof that any claim he might make to business ownership was fraudulent rather than legitimate marital property dispute. Caroline reported on the criminal complaint preparation and the status of the Bar Association complaint against Melissa Sullivan. The criminal complaint would be filed simultaneously with the divorce action, alleging multiple felony counts including forgery, identity theft, wire fraud, and theft. Caroline had coordinated with a prosecutor in the King County District Attorney's Office who specialized in white-collar crime. The prosecutor had reviewed our evidence and confirmed that it supported all the proposed charges. He had indicated that given the comprehensive documentation we had gathered, he anticipated being able to move quickly toward indictment once the complaint was formally filed. The bar complaint against Melissa Sullivan had already been submitted and was under investigation. Caroline had received confirmation that the Washington State Bar Association was treating the matter with high priority, given the serious nature of the ethical violations involved. Melissa would likely be suspended from practice pending the outcome of the investigation, and the evidence we had provided made disbarment nearly certain. Caroline noted that Melissa's professional destruction would serve an important secondary purpose beyond mere accountability. It would eliminate her ability to provide Daniel with legal advice or assistance in defending against the charges he faced. Marcus then shifted the discussion to what he termed the broader stakes beyond the immediate legal and financial dimensions. He asked me to consider what was truly at risk if we failed to act decisively, or if our legal strategy somehow proved insufficient to fully protect my interests. This was not simply about money that had been stolen or business ownership that had been fraudulently claimed. This was about the integrity of everything I had built through years of dedicated work, and the precedent that would be set about whether sophisticated fraud could succeed against even intelligent, accomplished targets. I had been thinking about exactly this question during the week since I had discovered Daniel's scheme. The stakes extended far beyond the quantifiable financial impact of his theft. My consulting firm represented 12 years of building expertise, relationships, and reputation in an extremely competitive field. I had started with nothing except my scientific knowledge and my commitment to providing pharmaceutical companies with research services they could trust completely. Every client relationship had been earned through delivering excellent work. Every methodology I had developed had emerged from countless hours of study, experimentation, and refinement. My firm's value was not simply the revenue it generated, but the professional identity and purpose it provided. If Daniel succeeded in stealing my business or even in creating sufficient legal complexity that I was forced to settle his fraudulent claims, the impact would extend beyond my personal loss. My 3 employees depended on the firm for their livelihoods. My clients relied on the continuity and quality of service my firm provided for their critical regulatory submissions. The broader pharmaceutical consulting community would see a precedent where fraud and forgery could succeed in appropriating a legitimately built professional practice. The message would be that no amount of competence, hard work, or achievement could protect against a sufficiently patient and calculating betrayal. There was also the personal dimension that was harder to articulate but no less real. I had believed I was building a life partnership with someone who shared my values and supported my ambitions. I had trusted Daniel completely, defended that trust against occasional subtle warnings from friends and family, who sensed something was not quite right about his increasing involvement in my business affairs. I had chosen to see the best in him, to believe his expressions of pride in my accomplishments, to accept his explanations for behaviors that in retrospect had been warning signs of his true intentions. The discovery that our entire marriage had been a vehicle for positioning himself to steal from me represented a profound violation that went beyond financial harm. It suggested that my judgment about people was fundamentally flawed, that my capacity to trust was a dangerous vulnerability, rather than a strength. If I allowed Daniel's fraud to succeed even partially, if I accepted some compromise settlement that gave him a portion of what he had tried to steal, I would be validating his assessment that I was too naive and trusting to protect myself effectively. I shared these reflections with the legal team, explaining that while I certainly cared about recovering the money Daniel had stolen and protecting my business from his fraudulent claims, the deeper stakes involved reclaiming my sense of agency and demonstrating that intelligence and preparation could defeat even sophisticated deception. I told them I needed to know that I had fought with everything I had to protect what I had built, not for vengeance but for the principle that truth and legitimate achievement deserved protection against fraud and manipulation. Marcus nodded with understanding and told me that this perspective would actually strengthen our legal strategy. Judges and juries responded powerfully to cases where the stakes transcended mere financial dispute and touched on fundamental questions of justice and accountability. Our presentation of the case would emphasize not just the mechanics of what Daniel had done, but the broader betrayal of trust and the systematic nature of his scheme to steal from someone who had trusted him completely. Rebecca added that family court judges in particular became extremely engaged when cases involved one spouse systematically defrauding another through forged documents and fabricated claims. The court system existed in part to protect vulnerable parties from exploitation, and while I was hardly vulnerable in the conventional sense, the nature of Daniel's betrayal and the sophistication of his fraud placed me squarely within the category of someone deserving the court's protection. She anticipated that once we presented our evidence, the judge would be highly motivated to ensure Daniel faced full consequences, and that I received complete protection. Patricia raised another dimension of what was at stake that I had not fully considered. Daniel's theft and fraud had created potential professional consequences for me beyond the immediate business impact. Several of my clients were publicly traded pharmaceutical companies subject to strict regulatory oversight. If Daniel's fraud became public through criminal proceedings or divorce litigation, my clients might face questions from their own compliance departments about whether their confidential information had been properly protected. Even though I had been the victim of Daniel's unauthorized access to my business systems, the mere fact that a security breach had occurred might cause some clients to question whether they could continue working with my firm. Patricia recommended that we develop a proactive communication strategy for my clients, explaining the situation in terms that emphasized my role as victim of fraud, while assuring them that all confidential information remained secure, and that I had taken comprehensive steps to prevent any future unauthorized access. This communication would need to be carefully timed to occur after we had taken legal action against Daniel, but before news of the criminal charges became public through court filings or media coverage. Marcus agreed with this recommendation and suggested we also consider how to manage potential media attention. Cases involving sophisticated fraud between spouses, particularly when the victim was a successful professional woman, often attracted significant media interest. We needed to be prepared for the possibility that reporters might contact me or my business seeking comment on the criminal charges and divorce proceedings. Marcus recommended we retain a crisis communications specialist who could help manage media inquiries and protect my professional reputation during what would inevitably be a difficult public period. Caroline interjected with a thought about the personal emotional stakes that I would face regardless of how successfully we protected my business and financial interests. She reminded me that I would need to process the grief of a failed marriage, the betrayal of trust, and the violation of having someone I loved systematically lie to me for years. The legal strategy we were developing would address the practical dimensions of Daniel's fraud, but it would not heal the emotional wounds or restore the years I had invested in a relationship that had never been what I believed it to be. She suggested I consider working with a therapist who specialized in helping people recover from intimate betrayal, particularly betrayal that involved financial exploitation. Caroline explained that many people who experienced what I was facing struggled with self-blame, questioning how they could have missed the signs or wondering whether they had been foolish to trust. Professional support could help me maintain perspective and avoid internalizing responsibility for someone else's deliberate deception. I acknowledged Caroline's concern and told her I would consider therapy once the immediate crisis was resolved. In that moment, I felt I needed to maintain complete focus on the legal strategy and evidence gathering without allowing emotional processing to interfere with clear decision-making. However, I recognized that at some point I would need to grieve what I had lost and work through the impact of Daniel's betrayal on my capacity to trust in future relationships. Marcus returned the discussion to immediate tactical decisions. He outlined the timeline for coordinated action. The following morning, we would file the divorce petition and emergency motions under seal. Simultaneously, Caroline would file the criminal complaint with the district attorney's office. We would request an emergency hearing on the restraining order motions for the afternoon of the same day, giving Daniel minimal time to respond or to take actions that might compromise assets or evidence. Marcus explained that the element of surprise was crucial. Daniel currently believed he had successfully maintained his deception, and that I remained completely unaware of his fraud. This false confidence meant he had not taken defensive measures to hide assets or destroy evidence. Once he was served with divorce papers and learned that criminal charges were being filed, he would immediately shift into defensive mode and might attempt to conceal evidence or transfer funds to locations we could not easily access. We needed to move decisively before he had any opportunity to implement contingency plans. The plan required that I maintain my performance of normalcy for approximately 18 more hours. I would return home after our meeting, continue caring for Daniel during his fake illness, and give no indication whatsoever that I knew about his scheme or that legal action was imminent. The following morning, I would leave the house as though going to my office for normal business activities. Instead, I would meet the legal team at the courthouse where we would file all necessary documents simultaneously. A process server would arrive at our house approximately 30 minutes after filing to serve Daniel with the divorce petition and notice of the emergency restraining order hearing. The service would occur at a moment when Daniel would have no advance warning and no opportunity to remove assets or evidence from our home. Simultaneously, King County Sheriff's deputies would serve him with notice that criminal charges had been filed, and that he should expect to be contacted by investigators who would want to interview him about the fraud allegations. Rebecca explained that the psychological impact of this coordinated service would be significant. Daniel would go from believing he was successfully executing his fraud scheme to discovering within minutes that I had uncovered everything, that I had gathered comprehensive evidence, that I had assembled a legal team to pursue both criminal and civil remedies, and that his immediate future involved court appearances, criminal investigation, and professional destruction. The shock would likely compromise his ability to respond strategically in the critical early hours when defendants often make mistakes that further damage their legal position. Marcus added that we should anticipate Daniel would immediately attempt to contact Melissa for legal advice and emotional support. However, Melissa would be dealing with her own crisis since the bar complaint against her would become active once the criminal charges referencing her involvement were filed. She would likely advise Daniel to immediately retain criminal defense counsel and would distance herself from him to minimize her own legal exposure. This would leave Daniel isolated and facing charges without the co-conspirator who had helped him plan his fraud. Patricia raised a final consideration about asset recovery. Even if we successfully prevented Daniel from executing the fraudulent business sale and obtained judgments against him for the money he had stolen, actually collecting those funds might prove challenging if he had already moved money to accounts we could not locate or if he had spent the stolen funds. She recommended we work with a forensic investigator who specialized in tracing hidden assets to identify any accounts or property Daniel might have acquired using stolen money. I told Patricia to proceed with retaining that investigator. The goal was not simply preventing further theft, but recovering everything Daniel had already taken. Every dollar he had stolen represented hours of my work, value I had created through my expertise and effort. I wanted complete recovery not just for the money itself, but to demonstrate that theft carried consequences that could not be avoided through clever asset protection strategies. Marcus concluded the meeting by confirming each team member's assignments and the precise timeline for the following day's coordinated filing. We would convene at the courthouse at 7:30 in the morning to complete final document review before the clerk's office opened at 8. Filing would occur immediately upon opening to ensure we could request the emergency hearing for that same afternoon. The process server and sheriff's deputies would be positioned to serve Daniel at 8:45, giving us enough time to confirm successful filing but minimizing the window during which he might somehow be tipped off about the pending legal action. As I prepared to leave the meeting and return home for my final performance of The Unknowing Wife, Rebecca pulled me aside for a private conversation. She told me that she had handled many difficult divorce cases over her 20-year career, but few had involved the level of premeditated fraud and betrayal that characterized my situation. She wanted me to understand that what Daniel had done was not a reflection of any failing on my part. Trusting one's spouse was not naivety. It was the foundation of functional marriage. Daniel had weaponized normal marital trust to perpetrate fraud that would have been impossible if I had approached my marriage with constant suspicion and verification. Rebecca explained that she had seen many clients in high-asset divorces blame themselves for not recognizing warning signs or not protecting themselves better against betrayal. She urged me not to fall into that psychological trap. The responsibility for Daniel's fraud rested entirely with Daniel. The fact that his deception had been sophisticated enough to fool someone as intelligent and analytical as I was spoke to his culpability, not to any deficiency in my judgment or character. I thanked Rebecca for her perspective and told her I would try to maintain that understanding as events unfolded. In truth, I was still processing the complex emotions that accompanied discovering such comprehensive betrayal. Part of me felt angry at myself for missing signs that seemed obvious in retrospect. Another part recognized that Daniel had deliberately exploited normal human trust, and that no amount of vigilance could protect against someone willing to construct such elaborate lies over such an extended period. I drove home that afternoon preparing myself mentally for the final 18 hours of performance. Daniel would be expecting me to return focused on my consulting work, but still attentive to his supposed medical needs. I would provide exactly that performance while knowing that by the following evening, his entire fraudulent scheme would be exposed and his carefully constructed plans would be in ruins. When I arrived home, Daniel was in the living room appearing to rest on the couch as he had done countless times over the past months. He looked up as I entered and smiled weakly, asking how my client call had gone. I provided a detailed response about imaginary client discussions, maintaining the professional focus he expected while asking about how he had been feeling during my absence. He launched into his familiar description of symptoms, the same performance he had refined over months of practice. I sat with him for an hour, maintaining the caring presence of a concerned spouse, while internally counting down the hours until I would never need to perform this role again. Daniel had no idea that every question I asked, every expression of concern I offered, was simply data collection for the final chapter of his exposure. He had spent months studying my patterns and exploiting my trust. I had spent 1 week learning to match his deception with my own performance, and mine would prove far more consequential than his had ever been. That evening, I prepared dinner and brought Daniel his meal in the living room where he claimed to be too weak to come to the table. I sat with him while he ate, discussing mundane household matters and his upcoming doctor's appointment. The appointment was scheduled for 3 days later, an appointment that would never occur because by then Daniel would be dealing with criminal charges and divorce proceedings rather than maintaining his fake illness. After dinner, I told Daniel I needed to prepare materials for an important client presentation the following day. This was consistent with my normal work patterns and gave me a legitimate reason to spend the evening in my office rather than sitting with him. He accepted this explanation readily, telling me he would likely go to bed early since he was feeling particularly exhausted. I recognized this as preparation for another evening with Melissa, another night when he would wait for me to become absorbed in work and then slip out of the house to spend time with his accomplice. I worked in my office with the door slightly ajar, listening for sounds of Daniel's movement. Just after 9 o'clock, I heard him carefully descending the stairs, moving with none of the weakness he displayed during the day. I heard the back door open and close quietly. I waited 5 minutes and then moved to the window where I could see our driveway. Daniel's car was gone, confirming what I already knew about his evening activities. I used his absence to conduct a final search of our home for any evidence or documents I might have missed in previous reviews. I photographed additional financial records I found in Daniel's office, including notes about the planned business sale timeline and contact information for the companies he had been negotiating with. I secured these materials in the cloud backup systems where Daniel could not access or delete them. Even if he somehow gained advance warning of the legal action, we would take the following morning. Daniel returned home around midnight, moving quietly through the house under the apparent assumption that I was asleep. I heard him pause outside my office door, likely checking whether I was still working. I had deliberately left my office light on but positioned myself in the guest room where I could observe without being seen. He seemed satisfied that I was occupied with work as usual and retired to our bedroom, completely unaware that this would be his final night of successful deception. I spent those final hours before dawn reviewing everything one last time, ensuring that our legal strategy was comprehensive, and that I had not overlooked any dimension of Daniel's fraud. The stakes were absolutely clear to me now. This was not simply about money or property. This was about whether systematic fraud could succeed against someone who had built legitimate success through dedication and expertise. This was about whether trust could be so completely weaponized that even intelligent people had no defense against betrayal. This was about proving that truth and preparation could defeat even the most sophisticated deception when wielded with determination and strategic discipline. By the time the sun rose on the morning we would take action, I had moved past anger and hurt into crystalline clarity about what needed to happen. Daniel had planned his fraud meticulously. We had planned our response with even greater precision. He had spent months positioning himself to steal everything I had built. We had spent 1 week building an airtight case that would ensure he faced complete consequences for every lie and every forged signature. The performance he had sustained for months would end today. The performance I had maintained for 1 week would prove decisive. And the stakes that Daniel had created when he chose to build his future on theft and fraud would be resolved in a manner that would demonstrate exactly what happened when calculation and malice confronted intelligence and righteous determination. I left the house at 7:15 that morning, telling Daniel I had an early meeting with a potential new client in downtown Seattle. He accepted this explanation without question, offering a weak smile and reminding me to drive carefully. I looked at him one final time as he performed his fragile invalid routine, and I felt a strange sense of detachment. This person lying in our bed pretending to be too ill to rise was a stranger wearing the face of someone I had once believed I loved. The real Daniel, if such a person had ever existed beyond the performance, remained unknown to me. The drive to the courthouse took 23 minutes through light morning traffic. I parked in the public garage and made my way to the meeting point Marcus had designated, a coffee shop across the street from the King County Superior Court building. The legal team was already assembled when I arrived. Marcus, Rebecca, Caroline, and Patricia sat at a corner table, reviewing final versions of the documents we would file within the next 40 minutes. Marcus handed me copies of everything we had prepared. The divorce petition ran to 47 pages, including exhibits that documented Daniel's fraud with clinical precision. The emergency motion for restraining orders outlined exactly why immediate court intervention was necessary to prevent Daniel from executing his planned theft. The exhibits attached to these filings included selected excerpts from the recorded conversation between Daniel and Melissa, portions of Patricia's forensic accounting report, examples of the forged partnership documents, and the access log showing Daniel's unauthorized entry into my business systems. Rebecca walked me through each section, ensuring I understood what we were requesting from the court and what Daniel would learn when he was served with these documents in approximately 2 hours. The divorce petition sought complete dissolution of our marriage, with a finding that Daniel had committed fraud throughout the relationship. It requested that all marital property be awarded to me as compensation for his theft and deception. It demanded Daniel pay my attorney fees and costs associated with defending against his fraudulent claims. Most importantly, it asked the court to declare my consulting firm my separate property immune from any claim Daniel might attempt to assert. The emergency restraining orders would prevent Daniel from accessing any bank accounts, from contacting my employees or clients, from representing himself as having any connection to my business, from disposing of any property, and from coming within 500 feet of my office location. These restrictions would remain in effect pending the emergency hearing scheduled for 3 o'clock that afternoon, at which point the court would decide whether to extend them throughout the divorce proceedings. Caroline showed me the criminal complaint that would be filed simultaneously with the district attorney's office. The complaint outlined charges of forgery in the first degree, identity theft in the first degree, theft in the first degree, and wire fraud. Each charge was supported by specific evidence from the materials we had gathered. The complaint included a recommendation that Daniel be arrested and held on bail, given the sophisticated nature of his fraud, and the risk that he might attempt to flee or hide assets if he remained free pending trial. I signed the necessary verification statements confirming that everything in the divorce petition was true and accurate to the best of my knowledge. My signature felt steady despite the magnitude of what we were about to set in motion. At 7:55, we crossed the street and entered the courthouse. The clerk's office opened promptly at 8, and Marcus filed our documents while Rebecca, Caroline, and I waited in the hallway. The filing process took less than 10 minutes. By 8:12, our divorce petition and emergency motions were officially part of the court record. Marcus emerged from the clerk's office with filed copies of all documents stamped with the official case number. He immediately contacted the process server and the sheriff's office to confirm they were positioned to serve Daniel at the designated time. Both confirmed readiness. The process server was parked 2 blocks from our house waiting for the signal to proceed. The sheriff's deputies assigned to serve the criminal complaint notice were similarly positioned. Everything was coordinated to occur at 8:45, providing Daniel no opportunity to receive warning or to begin implementing defensive measures. We moved to a conference room Marcus had reserved in a law office building adjacent to the courthouse. From there, we could monitor developments remotely while preparing for the afternoon emergency hearing. At exactly 8:45, Marcus received confirmation that service had been completed. The process server reported that Daniel had answered the door still wearing pajamas, apparently surprised by the early morning visit. He had accepted the papers with visible confusion, asked what they were about, and been informed only that they were legal documents requiring his immediate attention, and that he was ordered to appear in court at 3 o'clock that afternoon. 2 minutes later, the sheriff's deputies confirmed they had also served Daniel with notice of the criminal complaint. They reported that Daniel's confusion had shifted to visible alarm when he understood he was facing potential criminal charges. He had attempted to ask the deputies questions about the nature of the charges, but they had provided only basic information and advised him to retain legal counsel immediately. Marcus explained that we should expect Daniel to take several predictable actions over the next few hours. First, he would read through the divorce petition and begin to comprehend the full scope of what I had discovered about his fraud. Second, he would attempt to contact Melissa for advice and support, only to discover she was facing her own professional crisis. Third, he would likely try to reach me to demand explanations or attempt to convince me that the situation was somehow a misunderstanding. Fourth, once he fully grasped that his scheme had been exposed, he would retain criminal defense counsel and probably attempt to access or move assets before the restraining orders took full effect. Rebecca had anticipated this final possibility and had included in our emergency motion a request for the court to issue temporary restraining orders effective immediately upon filing rather than waiting for the afternoon hearing. The judge assigned to our case had reviewed our motion within minutes of filing and had granted the immediate temporary orders based on the clear evidence of ongoing fraud. This meant that by the time Daniel finished reading the divorce petition and began attempting to access bank accounts or contact my business, those actions would already be legally prohibited, and any violations would constitute contempt of court. My phone began buzzing with calls from Daniel at 9:17. I did not answer. He called 6 more times over the next 20 minutes, each call going to voicemail. He left 3 messages, the first asking me to call him immediately because something terrible had happened, the second demanding to know what was going on and insisting we needed to talk, the third shifting to anger and accusing me of betraying him and destroying our marriage. I listened to these messages with the same detachment I had felt watching him perform his fake illness that morning. Caroline's phone rang at 9:42. The call came from a number she did not recognize. She answered and put the call on speaker so the entire team could hear. The caller identified herself as Jennifer Walsh, an attorney who had just been retained by Daniel to represent him in the divorce proceedings. Walsh asked to speak with me directly. Caroline politely declined and explained that all communication should go through our legal team. Walsh tried to argue that Daniel deserved the opportunity to speak with his wife directly to attempt to resolve what she characterized as a misunderstanding before things escalated further. Rebecca took over the call with precision that reflected her years of experience in contentious divorces. She informed Walsh that there was no misunderstanding, that we had comprehensive evidence of systematic fraud, forgery and theft, that criminal charges had been filed based on that evidence, and that Daniel would have full opportunity to respond through appropriate legal channels at the emergency hearing that afternoon. She added that any attempt by Daniel to contact me directly would violate the restraining orders and would be reported to the court as contempt. Walsh's tone shifted from conciliatory to coldly professional as she acknowledged this information and ended the call. Marcus noted that Daniel had retained counsel remarkably quickly, suggesting he had contingency plans in place in case his fraud was discovered. Walsh was a competent divorce attorney with a reputation for aggressive tactics, but she specialized in marital property disputes rather than cases involving criminal fraud. Her retention suggested Daniel either had not yet fully grasped the criminal exposure he faced or had not yet located appropriate criminal defense counsel. Patricia received an automated alert at 10:15 from the monitoring system she had placed on several of our financial accounts. The alert indicated that someone had attempted to access our primary joint checking account from an unrecognized device and had been blocked due to the security measures Patricia had implemented. A second alert followed minutes later showing a similar blocked access attempt on the business credit line Daniel had fraudulently established. These attempts demonstrated that Daniel was indeed trying to move or access funds, exactly as we had anticipated. Rebecca immediately drafted a notice to the court documenting these attempted violations of the temporary restraining orders. She filed the notice electronically, creating a record that would be available to the judge at the afternoon hearing. These violation attempts would support our argument that Daniel posed an ongoing threat to marital and business assets, and that the most restrictive possible orders were necessary to prevent further fraud. Caroline received a call at 10:48 from the King County prosecutor handling the criminal complaint. He reported that his office had attempted to contact Daniel to schedule an interview regarding the fraud allegations, but Daniel's newly retained attorney had declined on his behalf and indicated Daniel would be asserting his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The prosecutor noted this was a predictable response, but also indicated consciousness of guilt that would be relevant if the case proceeded to trial. The prosecutor also informed Caroline that based on the strength of our evidence, his office would be seeking an arrest warrant for Daniel, rather than simply allowing him to turn himself involuntarily. The sophisticated nature of the fraud, the substantial amounts of money involved, and the risk that Daniel might attempt to flee or hide assets justified treating him as a flight risk requiring secured detention. The prosecutor anticipated obtaining the arrest warrant within 24 to 48 hours pending completion of additional investigation to ensure all charges were properly supported. As we approached noon, Marcus suggested we break for lunch before beginning our final preparation for the emergency hearing. We walked to a restaurant near the courthouse where we could continue working while eating. I found I had no appetite despite having eaten nothing since the previous evening. The adrenaline and focus that had sustained me through the morning were giving way to the physical and emotional exhaustion of sustaining intense concentration while processing the reality of what was happening. Caroline sat beside me and quietly asked how I was holding up. I told her the truth, which was that I felt oddly numb, as though I were watching events unfold from a distance rather than experiencing them directly. She explained that this dissociative response was common when people faced overwhelming stress and betrayal. The emotional impact would likely hit me more fully once the immediate crisis had passed and I had time to process what had happened. She reminded me that therapy resources would be available when I was ready, and that I should not hesitate to seek that support. Rebecca used the lunch hour to review the presentation strategy for the afternoon hearing. She would handle the primary argument, walking the judge through the evidence of Daniel's fraud, and explaining why the restraining orders needed to remain in place throughout the divorce proceedings. I would provide testimony about discovering the fraud and about the history of my business to establish that it was my separate property. Patricia would be available to testify about the forensic accounting analysis if the judge wanted detailed explanation of the financial evidence. Marcus explained what I should expect from the hearing itself. The judge would have reviewed our filed materials in advance and would likely have formed preliminary conclusions about the merits of our requests. Daniel and his attorney would have opportunity to respond and to present contrary evidence if they had any. However, given that Daniel had been served only hours earlier, it was unlikely he would have had time to prepare a comprehensive defense. More likely, his attorney would argue that he needed more time to review the allegations and would request a continuance of the hearing. Rebecca anticipated this argument and had prepared a response explaining why immediate restraining orders were necessary regardless of Daniel's need for additional preparation time. The evidence of ongoing fraud attempts that morning, including his violations of the temporary restraining orders by trying to access financial accounts, demonstrated that delay would create unacceptable risk of further harm. At 2:30, we returned to the courthouse and made our way to the family court division where our hearing would occur. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, designed for hearings rather than full trials. Daniel and his attorney were already present when we entered. This was the first time I had seen Daniel since leaving the house that morning, and the change in his appearance was striking. He looked haggard and diminished, stripped of the confident performance he had maintained for months. When he saw me enter with my legal team, his expression cycled rapidly through anger, desperation, and what might have been genuine fear. Jennifer Walsh, Daniel's attorney, approached Rebecca and requested a brief private conversation. They stepped into the hallway while the rest of us took our seats at the petitioner's table. Through the courtroom windows, I could see Rebecca and Walsh engaged in what appeared to be intense discussion. Rebecca's posture remained confident and unmoved while Walsh gestured with increasing animation. They returned after 5 minutes. Rebecca quietly informed Marcus that Walsh had offered a settlement proposal. Daniel was willing to agree to divorce with an even split of marital property excluding my business if I would agree not to pursue criminal charges. Rebecca had declined the offer immediately and had explained that the decision to prosecute was not mine to make given that criminal complaints had already been filed, but that even if it were, there would be no settlement that gave Daniel a single dollar of assets he had attempted to steal through fraud. The bailiff called the court to order at precisely 3 o'clock. Judge Sarah Martinez entered and took the bench. She was in her mid-50s with a demeanor that suggested both intelligence and impatience with procedural games. She reviewed the file in front of her briefly before looking up at both tables. Judge Martinez addressed Rebecca first, asking for a concise summary of our emergency motion and the basis for requesting immediate restraining orders. Rebecca delivered a presentation that was masterful in its clarity and precision. She outlined Daniel's multi-year fraud scheme, his forgery of business documents, his theft of hundreds of thousands of dollars, his fake illness designed to keep me distracted during the final phase of his plan, and his attempted violations of the temporary restraining orders that very morning. She emphasized that every allegation was supported by documentary evidence including recorded admissions, forged documents, unauthorized access logs, and forensic accounting analysis. Judge Martinez listened without interruption, making occasional notes. When Rebecca finished, the judge turned to Walsh and asked what response the respondent offered to these serious allegations. Walsh stood and argued that her client had only been served that morning, that the allegations were complex and required time to investigate and respond to properly, and that many of the supposed fraudulent documents might have innocent explanations related to normal marital financial management. Judge Martinez cut her off mid-sentence. The judge stated that she had reviewed the filed materials in detail, including the recorded conversation where Daniel explicitly discussed forging documents and planning to steal his wife's business. She noted that the evidence presented was not ambiguous or subject to innocent interpretation. She asked Walsh directly whether her client denied making the statements captured in that recording. Walsh hesitated, clearly caught between her obligation to advocate for her client and the impossibility of denying recorded evidence. She responded that she had not yet had opportunity to review the recording in detail with her client and could not speak to its authenticity or context. Judge Martinez observed dryly that the recording had been filed with the court 6 hours earlier, and that Walsh had had ample time to discuss it with her client if she had prioritized doing so. The judge then asked whether Daniel wished to testify about any of the allegations. Walsh quickly stated that her client would be asserting his Fifth Amendment rights and would not testify. Judge Martinez noted this decision for the record, while observing that it was an interesting choice for someone who claimed the allegations against him were based on misunderstandings rather than actual fraud. Judge Martinez announced her ruling without further deliberation. She found that the evidence presented demonstrated clear and convincing proof of fraud, forgery, theft, and ongoing attempts to misappropriate marital and business assets. She ordered that all restraining orders requested in our motion would remain in full effect throughout the pendency of the divorce proceedings. Daniel was prohibited from accessing any financial accounts, from contacting me except through counsel, from coming near my business or residence except to retrieve personal belongings under supervision, and from disposing of or encumbering any property. The judge went further than our requested orders. She directed that Daniel submit to the court within 72 hours a complete accounting of all assets he controlled, all bank accounts in his name, and all property he had acquired during the marriage. She appointed a special master to review Daniel's financial disclosure and to investigate any discrepancies between his representations and the evidence we had presented. She set a case management conference for 2 weeks later to establish a timeline for full disclosure and to address any additional issues that emerged from ongoing investigation. Finally, Judge Martinez addressed Daniel directly. She told him that she was referring the evidence of his restraining order violations that morning to the criminal division for potential contempt charges. She noted that the sophistication and premeditation evident in his fraud scheme suggested he posed a serious risk of further misconduct. She warned him that any additional violations of her orders would result in immediate arrest and detention pending trial. The hearing concluded at 3:37. Daniel and his attorney left immediately without attempting to approach me or my legal team. I watched him walk out of the courtroom and recognized that this was likely the last time I would see him outside the formal legal proceedings that would occupy the coming months. The man I had married no longer existed, if he ever truly had. What remained was a criminal facing consequences for calculated fraud. Marcus expressed satisfaction with the hearing outcome. The rulings had given us everything we requested and more. The special master appointment meant an independent investigator would help uncover any assets Daniel might attempt to hide. The contempt referral created additional criminal exposure that would pressure Daniel toward cooperation. Most importantly, the restraining orders meant my business and personal assets were now protected by court order backed by threat of arrest. Rebecca noted that Daniel's attorney had appeared unprepared and overwhelmed by the evidence we presented. This suggested Daniel had not been forthcoming with Walsh about the full extent of his fraud, possibly because he had still been hoping to characterize the situation as a marital dispute rather than criminal conduct. Walsh would likely withdraw from representation once she fully understood what her client had done, leaving Daniel scrambling to find new counsel willing to take on a case with such damaging evidence. As we left the courthouse that evening, Caroline asked where I planned to stay. I told her I had maintained my hotel room and would continue staying there rather than returning to the house I had shared with Daniel. The thought of sleeping in that house, in the bed where Daniel had performed his fake illness while planning to steal everything I had built, was intolerable. Caroline offered to stay with me, but I told her I needed some time alone to begin processing what had happened. The hotel room felt sterile and anonymous after the intensity of the day's events. I sat by the window looking out at the Seattle skyline as dusk settled over the city. My phone showed dozens of missed calls and messages, some from Daniel's number and others from numbers I did not recognize that were likely his family members or friends seeking to understand what was happening. I had no intention of responding to any of them. Instead, I opened my laptop and began reviewing the timeline of Daniel's fraud that Patricia had created. I studied the pattern of his unauthorized access to my business systems, the progression of his document forgery, the escalation of his theft from small amounts to substantial sums. What emerged was a picture of extraordinary patience and planning. This had not been impulsive or opportunistic crime. This had been a multi-year campaign of systematic betrayal executed with discipline and attention to detail. I thought about all the moments over those years when I could have noticed what was happening if I had been less trusting or more suspicious. The times Daniel had asked seemingly innocent questions about my business valuation or client contracts. The occasions when he had offered to handle administrative tasks that gave him access to financial systems. The periods when he had been particularly attentive and supportive, which I now recognized as phases when he was actively implementing new aspects of his fraud scheme and needed me distracted and grateful. But I also recognized, as Rebecca had counseled, that the responsibility for this deception rested entirely with Daniel. I had approached my marriage with good faith and trust because those were the foundations of healthy relationships. The fact that Daniel had exploited that trust spoke to his character, not to any failing in mine. No amount of suspicion or protective measures could have completely prevented someone this committed to fraud from finding ways to steal, short of approaching every relationship as adversarial rather than collaborative. What I could control was my response to discovering the truth. And in that response, I had demonstrated capabilities Daniel had completely underestimated. He had studied my professional expertise and my trusting nature, but he had failed to recognize that the same analytical intelligence I applied to pharmaceutical research could be redirected toward documenting fraud and building legal cases. He had assumed my decency was weakness when it was actually the foundation of a different kind of strength. The pattern I recognized most clearly as I sat in that hotel room was not the pattern of Daniel's fraud. It was the pattern of my own capacity for strategic response when faced with crisis. I had discovered his betrayal in the most devastating possible way, standing outside my own bedroom listening to him laugh about deceiving me. In that moment, I could have chosen emotional confrontation, immediate exposure, or collapse into victimhood. Instead, I had chosen methodical evidence gathering, strategic planning, and coordinated legal action. I had performed normalcy with the same discipline Daniel had performed illness. I had assembled a team of experts and deployed their capabilities with precision. I had waited for exactly the right moment to act, ensuring maximum impact and minimal opportunity for Daniel to implement defensive measures. This pattern revealed something about myself that I had not fully recognized before. My professional success had not been merely the product of intelligence or technical expertise. It had emerged from capacity for sustained focus, strategic thinking under pressure, and thorough preparation before acting. These same capabilities had proven equally effective when applied to protecting myself against fraud. The realization was both empowering and sobering. Empowering because it confirmed I possessed resources beyond what Daniel had recognized or accounted for in his planning. Sobering because it meant the coming months of legal proceedings would require sustaining that same level of strategic discipline, while managing the emotional impact of divorce and betrayal. As darkness settled completely outside my hotel window, I made a decision about how I would approach what came next. I would not simply defend against Daniel's fraud. I would ensure it became a complete case study in the consequences of calculated betrayal. Every forged document would be exposed. Every unauthorized transaction would be traced. Every lie would be documented and presented to courts, prosecutors, and anyone else whose judgment mattered. Daniel had thought he was stealing from someone too trusting to notice and too naive to fight back effectively. He would learn that he had instead attempted to steal from someone who combined professional excellence with strategic capability and absolute determination to protect what she had legitimately built. The pattern of his fraud would be matched by the pattern of my response, and history would record which pattern proved more powerful. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.